October 25, 1944, 6:58 hours, the Philippine Sea, off the coast of Samar Island. Commander Kikichi Mori stands on the bridge of the heavy cruiser Chikuma, binoculars pressed to his eyes. Through the morning haze he counts the silhouettes. Small escort carriers, thin-hulled destroyers, his lips curl. These are not warships. They are cargo vessels with flight decks bolted on. Sheep wandered from their flock. He lowers the binoculars and permits himself a rare smile. The largest Japanese naval force assembled since Midway is about to crush what appears to be a supply convoy. There is no American battle line between them and the invasion beaches. But Commander Mori does not yet know what is sailing toward him at flank speed. Vice Admiral Takeo, Kurita's center force, has emerged through San Bernardino Strait completely undetected, 4 battleships steam in formation behind him, including Yamato, the largest warship ever constructed by human hands, 6 heavy cruisers. 2 light cruisers and 11 destroyers follow. American intelligence believed this armada was retreating. They were catastrophically wrong. In precisely 8 seconds, a single American salvo will shatter everything the Imperial Japanese Navy believes about its enemy. The men aboard those insignificant escort ships are about to demonstrate what happens when desperation collides with American naval gunnery. The sheep have teeth. The contempt ran deeper than strategy. It lived in the bones of every Japanese naval officer, taught from their first day at Edejima Naval Academy. Seishin, spiritual power, would always triumph over mere material strength. American sailors were soft, raised in comfort, lacking the warrior soul forged through centuries of Bushido discipline. One staff officer under Admiral Yamato had written dismissively that Americans do not possess the spiritual stamina necessary for protracted naval combat. This was not opinion, it was doctrine, and early victories had confirmed everything they believed. At the Battle of Savo Island in August 1942, Japanese cruisers had descended upon an Allied naval force in the darkness and annihilated it in 32 minutes. 4 Allied heavy cruisers sank beneath the waves. 1,077 Americans died. Japanese losses amounted to 0 ships and minimal casualties. A captured Japanese officer's diary later revealed the prevailing sentiment with brutal clarity. The Americans cannot fight at night. They rely on machines because their spirit is weak. This belief extended to their assessment of escort carriers. Japanese intelligence classified CVEs as auxiliary vessels, glorified transport ships with flight decks welded on as an afterthought. Technical specifications seemed to justify the dismissal. Maximum speed of 18 knots, hulls so thin that armor-piercing shells might pass through without detonating, armament limited to a single 5-inch gun. Naval doctrine designated them tertiary targets, hardly worth the ammunition required to sink them. Letters home from Japanese officers revealed not just intellectual contempt, but emotional pity for the American sailors consigned to such vessels. They would never know the honor of true combat. By October 1944, despite mounting evidence of American industrial power, this certainty remained unshaken. Yet in the waters off Samar, every assumption was about to collide with a 5-inch shell traveling at 2,600 feet per second, and an American sailor who refused to read the Japanese script. At 6:45, a Japanese lookout aboard Yamato raised the alarm. Masts on the horizon. The silhouettes emerging from the morning haze triggered immediate confusion on the bridge. These vessels were too small to be fleet carriers, yet they carried aircraft. Admiral Curita squinted through his binoculars and made a fateful error. His exhausted mind, deprived of sleep for nearly 3 days, registered what doctrine told him should be there rather than what actually was. He believed he was facing a major American carrier task force. He was wrong. 13 miles away, the Americans were making their own horrified calculations. Aboard the escort carrier sent low, A signalman watched pagoda masts materialize from the haze, the distinctive superstructures of Japanese battleships that no American sailor ever wanted to see. The first radio transmission crackled across Taffy 3's frequency with barely controlled panic. Enemy surface force of 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, numerous destroyers bearing down on us. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague received the news on his bridge. His voice over the TBS radio remained steady, but the mathematics were catastrophic. There was no battle fleet coming to help. Admiral Halsey had taken the heavy ships north, chasing a Japanese decoy. Taffy 3 stood alone, but one commander had already made his decision. Aboard the destroyer USS Johnston, Commander Ernest E. Evans never hesitated. Before orders could arrive, before tactical plans could form, he swung his ship toward the enemy at flank speed. His announcement to the crew was simple: "We're going in. Prepare to attack." Johnston's sailors looked at each other. They understood. A single Fletcher-class destroyer was charging 4 battleships. Confusion gave way to something harder. Grim determination settled across the ship. At 6:59, Yamato opened fire. Her 18-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a warship, hurled shells weighing as much as automobiles. The splashes erupted around the American destroyers like volcanic geysers, columns of water towering hundreds of feet into the sky. Japanese officers permitted themselves satisfied nods. This would be brief slaughter. Then something unexpected happened. The Americans were not fleeing. The small ships were turning toward the battleships. On Japanese bridges, subtle confusion began spreading. This violated every tactical principle. This violated survival instinct itself. Why would destroyers charge dreadnoughts? What did these Americans know that Kurita did not? Commander Evans had made his choice. His 5-inch guns would now attempt the impossible. Johnston closed the distance with suicidal determination. Commander Evans drove his destroyer to within 10,000 yards of the Japanese heavy cruisers, a range where their 8-inch guns could hardly miss, where his own 5-inch weapons might actually matter. His gun crews worked with mechanical fury, feeding shells into breeches as fast as human hands could move. Over 200 rounds screamed toward the enemy in the opening minutes alone. Then Johnston launched her torpedoes. One of them found Kumano. The explosion tore the heavy cruiser's bow completely off. 30 feet of warship simply ceased to exist in a column of fire and twisted steel. Kumano staggered out of formation, her speed cut to a crawl, her role in the battle finished. On Japanese bridges, officers stared in disbelief. A destroyer had crippled a heavy cruiser. This was not supposed to happen. This violated every calculation their doctrine had provided. But Johnston was only the beginning. USS Samuel B. Roberts was not even a true destroyer. She was a destroyer escort, smaller, slower, built for convoy protection rather than fleet combat. Her crew had nicknamed her the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, and they were about to prove it. Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland addressed his men over the intercom as they prepared to attack. His words became immortal. "We're making a torpedo run. The outcome is doubtful, but we will do our duty." Samuel B. Roberts closed to 4,000 yards, point-blank range where misses became nearly impossible for both sides. She launched her 2 torpedoes, then kept firing. Her 5-inch guns blazed until the barrels literally glowed red, until paint blistered, until the rifling began to melt. Even then, her crew kept shooting. American destroyers laid desperate smoke screens, thick white curtains that obscured the fleeing escort carriers. A providential rain squall descended, hiding Taffy 3 beneath its gray veil. Japanese gunners cursed as their targets vanished, reappeared, attacked from unexpected angles. The organized fleet action Admiral Curita had envisioned dissolved into chaos. His ships fired at shadows. His formations scattered. The mathematics made no sense anymore. 23 Japanese ships, including the most powerful battleship afloat, faced 13 American vessels, none larger than an escort carrier. By every doctrine, every calculation, every lesson of naval warfare, this should have been a massacre lasting 30 minutes. Yet 1 hour passed. Then 2. Japanese heavy cruisers were burning. Chikuma took torpedo hits. Chakai erupted in flames. American ships kept fighting even as they themselves were being destroyed. Radio intercepts revealed growing confusion in Japanese communications. One officer's voice captured the bewilderment perfectly. "We were fighting something we did not understand." Each American attack that should have been suicidal proved devastatingly effective instead. The doctrine of spiritual superiority offered no explanation for this. Aboard Yamato, Admiral Kurita watched his cruisers burn. He possessed the firepower to annihilate the American force entirely. Yamato alone outweighed all of Taffy 3 combined. Yet doubt began gnawing at him, not about the outcome, not yet, but about the cost. If these were mere escort vessels fighting with such ferocity, what horrors awaited at Leyte Gulf itself? The Fletcher-class destroyers were never designed to fight battleships. Yet their specifications created possibilities that Japanese doctrine had never considered. USS Johnston displaced 2,500 tons and could sprint at 38 knots, faster than any Japanese battleship, faster than most cruisers. Her armament included 5 5-inch guns and 10 torpedo tubes loaded with Mark 15 torpedoes. Those torpedoes mattered enormously. Early in the war, American torpedoes had been notoriously unreliable, running too deep, failing to detonate. By 1944, those problems were solved. The weapons that crippled Kumano worked exactly as designed. But the 5-inch guns proved equally crucial in ways no one had anticipated. Japanese cruisers concentrated their armor around vital spaces, magazines, engine rooms, bridge structures. Much of their length remained protected only by thin steel. Against these unarmored sections, 5-inch shells proved devastating. They smashed into fire control stations, exploded among gun crews, ignited secondary fires that spread through passageways. The rate of fire created the real advantage. Johnston's guns could hurl 15 to 22 rounds per minute. Japanese 8-inch cruiser guns managed only 4 to 6. Quantity created its own quality. A cruiser might land 1 hit while absorbing a dozen in return. Radar-directed fire control amplified the disparity further. American gun directors could track targets through smoke and rain, while Japanese gunners squinted through optical rangefinders, estimating distances that American technology calculated precisely. Every shell from Johnston flew toward solutions computed by machines that Japanese warships simply did not carry. Above the surface battle, escort carriers demonstrated capabilities their critics had dismissed. Taffy 3's pilots flew over 450 sorties during the engagement. Avengers and Wildcats attacked relentlessly, many carrying bombs, some carrying nothing at all. Pilots made dry runs against battleships, forcing crews to take cover, disrupting aim, buying precious minutes. Some strafed Yamato's bridge with 50 caliber machine guns, pinpricks against armor perhaps, but each passed distracted gunners from the destroyers below. Behind everything loomed the industrial reality that shadowed Samar's chaos. Henry Kaiser's shipyards were producing escort carriers in 90 days each. 50 CVEs operated in the Pacific by October 1944, with more arriving monthly. Japan had no equivalent program. Even if Curita destroyed Taffy 3 entirely, replacements would steam toward the Philippines within weeks. Yamato had required 7 years to construct. America launched escort carriers faster than Japan could train the pilots to fly against them. Japanese weapons failed in ways their designers never imagined. Armor-piercing shells, engineered to penetrate battleship belts, passed directly through the thin hulls of escort carriers without detonating. Gun crews trained for formal fleet engagements could not adapt to chaotic close-range combat. Communications collapsed as formations scattered. The technical gap was not abstract. It meant that when a gunner's mate fed shells into Johnston's mounts, his rate of fire outpaced cruisers 10 times his ship's displacement. Industry became courage translated into steel. But technology alone cannot explain why American sailors charged battleships. Machines only explain how they survived long enough to die shooting. Commander Ernest E. Evans had made his promise long before Samar. At Johnston's commissioning ceremony in 1943, the Cherokee officer from Oklahoma addressed his crew with words that would prove prophetic. "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Not a single man left. Evans kept that promise on the morning of October 25th. After Johnston's initial torpedo run crippled Kumano, Japanese battleships found their range. 3 14-inch shells from Congo slammed into the destroyer, followed by 3 6-inch rounds from supporting cruisers. The hits wrecked Johnston's engine room, destroyed her steering gear, and killed dozens of her crew. Evans himself was wounded, his shirt torn away, fingers missing from one hand, shrapnel embedded in his body. He refused to leave the bridge. For 2 more hours, Evans commanded his crippled ship, directing fire by shouting through an open hatch to men manually operating the rudder below. Survivors later described him standing exposed, bleeding, somehow still giving coherent orders. Johnston absorbed hit after hit. At 9:45, dead in the water, she finally lost all power. Evans ordered abandon ship. He was last seen on the fantail, still organizing the evacuation. When Johnston sank at 10:10, Commander Evans went down with her. His body was never recovered. His Medal of Honor citation would note his extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry, words that barely captured the reality. Across the water, a Japanese officer was experiencing his own transformation. Commander Shigenori Hara watched the American destroyers through his binoculars with initial confidence that morning. His training had prepared him for this, the inevitable moment when superior Japanese spirit would crush American weakness. But as hours passed, confusion replaced certainty. The small ships would not break. They attacked, retreated into smoke, attacked again. They absorbed punishment that should have been fatal and kept shooting. Years later, Hara admitted what he had witnessed. "I could not understand what made them fight like that. We had been told they were soft, cowardly. These men were neither." The propaganda he had absorbed since childhood crumbled as he watched destroyers charge battleships. Something unexpected replaced his contempt. Respect. Aboard Samuel B. Roberts, gunner's mate 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr embodied the terror and duty that drove Taffy 3's sailors. His battle station was the aft 5-inch gun mount, and as the destroyer escort closed to 4,000 yards, his world became heat, smoke, and the deafening rhythm of continuous fire. Shell casings accumulated at his feet. The barrel glowed red, then orange. He kept loading. When a Japanese shell finally penetrated the mount, it detonated the ready ammunition. The explosion was catastrophic. Carr's entire gun crew was killed or mortally wounded, including Carr himself, whose abdomen was torn open. Rescue teams found him still clutching a 5-inch shell, trying to load it into the destroyed breech. He begged them to help him fire just once more. He died making the request. Paul Henry Carr was 22 years old. He was posthumously awarded the Silver Star for gallantry his citation could not adequately describe. Above the slaughter, pilots made their own impossible choices. Lieutenant Commander Edward Huxtable ran out of bombs within the battle's first hour. His Avenger had nothing left but machine guns, 50 caliber weapons useless against armored warships. He attacked anyway. Diving toward Yamato's bridge, He strafed the observation platforms, forcing officers to take cover, disrupting their aim for precious seconds. His logic was simple. If I could make them flinch, maybe a ship survives. None of these men expected to live. They fought knowing the mathematics guaranteed their destruction. The difference between American and Japanese spiritual doctrine was never about fighting spirit. It was about what you fight for. By 900, 3 American ships were sinking. The Japanese still held overwhelming force. And then Admiral Kurita made a decision that would haunt him until his death in 1977. At 9/11, Admiral Takeo Kurita issued the order that would define his legacy. All ships cease pursuit, come north, regroup. The signal flags climbed Yamato's halyards. Across the scattered Japanese formation, officers stared in disbelief at the message. They were winning. They were miles from the invasion beaches, the greatest collection of Japanese naval power since Midway was turning away from victory. The transports at Leyte Gulf sat defenseless beyond the horizon. Supply ships, troop carriers, the entire American invasion infrastructure waited within gun range of Kurita's battleships. 1 hour of steaming would bring them under Yamato's 18-inch rifles. Yet Kurita turned away from all of it. The 8-second collapse had finally completed itself. That metaphor crystallized everything. 8 seconds represented the gap between expectation and reality, the time required to understand that the world was not what doctrine promised. Kurita had expected to brush aside weak opposition and fall upon the American beaches like a typhoon. Instead, 2.5 hours of brutal resistance from supposedly inferior forces had shattered his certainty. Destroyers had charged his battleships. Escort carriers had launched endless waves of aircraft. His heavy cruisers were burning, sinking, falling out of formation. Exhaustion magnified every doubt. Kurita had been awake for nearly 72 hours. 2 days earlier, American submarines had torpedoed his previous flagship, Takeo, beneath him. He had swum through oil-covered water to survive. Now, standing on Yamato's bridge, surrounded by conflicting reports and rising confusion, his mind could not process what he was witnessing. Reports of American carrier aircraft convinced him that fleet carriers lurked nearby. He did not realize those planes came from the tiny escort carriers his force had been attacking. If these insignificant vessels fought with such ferocity, what would the actual battle fleet do when it arrived? The mathematics of doubt overwhelmed him. Chakai was sinking. Chikuma was dead in the water. Suzuya burned uncontrollably. He could destroy the remnants of Taffy 3, certainly, but at what cost? And for what purpose? His staff officers watched their Admiral weigh calculations they could not follow. Some protested. Junior officers expressed confusion that bordered on insubordination, but Kurita had decided. When the Japanese fleet turned north, American survivors watched in stunned disbelief. Rear Admiral Sprague reportedly gasped at the sight. "I could not believe my eyes. They were retiring." Not a single Japanese shell would fall on Leyte Gulf's beaches, the greatest concentration of Japanese surface power since Midway retreated from a force a fraction of its size. The 8-second gap between confidence and confusion had widened into permanent defeat. The Imperial Japanese Navy's surface fleet would never recover. But for survivors on both sides, the consequences were only beginning to unfold. Kurita's force limped back through San Bernardino Strait as darkness fell on October 25th. The fleet that had emerged with such confidence mere hours earlier now retreated in disarray. 3 heavy cruisers, Chikuma, Chakai, and Suzuya, were gone, sunk, or scuttled after damage made them unsalvageable. Several more warships trailed oil slicks and smoke, their crews fighting fires and flooding. The statistical outcome defied every expectation. Despite overwhelming superiority, the Japanese had lost more tonnage than the Americans they had attacked. The Leyte invasion proceeded without surface opposition. Not a single transport was touched. When reports reached Japanese high command, disbelief preceded fury. Kurita's superiors could not comprehend the message. Turned back by escort carriers, the most powerful surface fleet in the Pacific, driven away by converted cargo ships and destroyers. Discussions of court-martial circulated through Tokyo's naval headquarters. Kurita himself would spend the rest of his life conflicted about his decision. In post-war interviews, he offered explanations that never fully satisfied anyone, including himself. He went to his grave in 1977 still wrestling with that morning off Samar. The shockwave spread downward through the ranks with devastating effect. Japanese naval officers who had not been present at Samar heard the reports with growing unease. Letters and diaries from this period reveal a doctrinal crisis rippling through the service. If sation, spiritual power, guaranteed victory, what did defeat at the hands of inferior forces mean? The certainties taught at Edejima Naval Academy suddenly rang hollow. Morale reports from naval bases noted increasing fatalism among officers and enlisted men alike. Something fundamental had broken. The response came within days. The first organized kamikaze attacks occurred during the Leyte Gulf operations, with suicide aircraft crashing into American carriers just hours after Kurita's withdrawal. This was no coincidence. Japanese command had implicitly acknowledged that conventional tactics had failed. If American sailors would die charging battleships with destroyers, Japanese pilots would die diving their aircraft into carrier decks. The terrible mirror reflected both sides committed to sacrifice, but only one possessed the industrial base to sustain such losses. For Americans, victory carried its own costs that headlines obscured. Survivors from Johnston, Hull, Samuel B. Roberts, and the escort carrier Gambier Bay spent days floating in shark-infested waters. Rescue operations were delayed by confusion and competing priorities. Over 100 sailors died after their ships sank, from exposure, dehydration, and shark attacks. An Indianapolis-style tragedy unfolded in Samar's shadow, while newspapers celebrated the larger victory. Families received telegrams bearing news of sons and husbands who had charged battleships and never returned. After Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an offensive force. Remaining capital ships would be sunk at anchor by American aircraft or expended as suicide decoys. Yamato herself would die in April 1945, sent on a one-way mission against Okinawa. Japan would never again challenge American surface forces. The 8 seconds of collapsed confidence extended forward in time, becoming permanent defeat. But for survivors on both sides, the wounds remained fresh. And in the decades ahead, something unexpected would emerge from the wreckage. The contempt did not survive the war. Japanese officers who had watched the battle unfold returned home carrying memories that contradicted everything they had been taught. In post-war interviews, their transformation became undeniable. Captain Toshikazu Omi, a senior staff officer, offered perhaps the most striking reversal. "We had believed Americans could not fight with spirit. Samar proved us completely wrong. Those destroyer men were the bravest sailors I ever saw." Admiral Curita himself never fully escaped that morning off the Philippines. He lived until 1977, decades spent in quiet reflection on decisions that historians would endlessly debate. When interviewed about Samar, his answers carried weight beyond tactics. He spoke of exhaustion, of confusion, but also of something else, a grudging acknowledgement that the men who charged his battleships had earned respect that transcended national enmity. The propaganda of his youth had failed to prepare him for Commander Evans. American recognition followed, though the battle's nature created paradox. Officially, Samar was a defensive action, a desperate retreat, not a glorious charge. Yet emotionally, it became the most celebrated naval engagement of the Pacific War. Commander Ernest Evans received the Medal of Honor posthumously. Captain Copeland of Samuel B. Roberts received the Navy Cross. Dozens of other decorations recognized individual acts of courage. The citations spoke of extraordinary heroism, conspicuous gallantry, and complete disregard for personal safety. The language strained to capture what had actually occurred. Decades later, survivors from both sides met under different circumstances. Taffy 3 associations held reunions for years, the gatherings growing smaller as time claimed members one by one. Occasionally, Japanese veterans attended. The emotional weight of those encounters defied simple description. Men who had tried to kill each other exchanged handshakes, photographs, stories. What they understood required no translation. They had shared something that only those present could fully comprehend. In 2021, the wreck of USS Johnston was discovered at 21,180 feet, the deepest shipwreck ever located. Sonar images revealed her hull torn by shellfire, evidence of the brutal punishment she had absorbed. Survivor families wept at the photographs. The physical evidence confirmed what testimony had preserved. Johnston had died fighting, her wounds testament to what her crew had endured. The youngest Taffy 3 veterans are now approaching their final years. Oral history projects race against time to preserve their accounts. When asked what they want remembered, their answers carry remarkable consistency. Not glory, not heroism. The men beside them, the friends who did not return. One survivor perhaps said it best. "We weren't brave, we were just together." The Japanese contempt died at Samar. In its place grew something more honest. Courage is not cultural property. The Americans' willingness to die was the same warrior spirit that Japanese doctrine claimed exclusively. The difference was what they protected, not emperor, not empire, but the men on the next ship and the beaches behind them. Samar teaches a lesson that military academies still struggle to impart. Assumptions built on contempt are the most dangerous kind. The Japanese Navy had constructed an elaborate doctrine of spiritual superiority, reinforced by early victories and cultural certainty. Each confirming piece of evidence strengthened the belief. Each contradicting signal was dismissed. Confirmation bias became institutional blindness. When reality finally struck, it arrived not as gradual awakening but as violent collision. The danger of believing your own propaganda never expires. It merely waits for the next generation to relearn it. Industrial power and human will intertwined at Samar in ways neither factor alone explains. American shipyards had produced the vessels that fought that morning. American factories had manufactured the shells and torpedoes, but production did not decide how those weapons would be used. Sailors chose to charge battleships. Pilots chose to make dry runs with empty bomb racks. The machines enabled the sacrifice. They did not compel it. Modern strategists debating technology versus human factors in warfare would do well to study those 3 hours carefully. Neither element functions without the other. The pattern of underestimating adversaries based on cultural stereotypes persists today. Military analysts continue warning about similar blind spots. The comfortable assumption that certain opponents lack resolve, capability, or sophistication. The lesson is not about any specific nation. It is about a human tendency that transcends era and geography. Comfortable contempt feels satisfying until the moment it becomes fatal. 8 seconds captures the battle's meaning precisely. That narrow gap between the world as we believe it to be and the world as it actually is can remain hidden for years, even decades. Then suddenly, violently, it stands exposed. Rebuilding understanding takes far longer than destruction required. Return to that morning. Commander Mori stands on Chikuma's bridge, binoculars lowered, smiling at the escort carriers. He sees sheep. He does not know that his ship will sink before noon. He does not know that men on those small vessels have already decided how this story ends. They just have not told him yet. The battle off Samar lasted less than 3 hours. The collapse of certainty it produced echoed for generations. And in the mathematics of that morning, when 400 Americans died fighting ships they could not sink, but would not run from, there is a lesson that outlives all of them. Never mistake an enemy's size for his soul.